The original Spectrum, I think, was slightly less difficult because we'd already established maybe what a home computer might look like, through the ZX81. Although you could argue John Pemberton had really set the trail on that with the ZX80. But there were two significant differences between the 81 and the Spectrum, which they're crucial design differences that relate to how it's going to end up being. One is that we decided we had to address the complaints, let's call it, of a non-moving key keyboard. So we had to get what they call a proper keyboard in there, although they weren't going to get a proper keyboard, they were going to get something else because it would have still been too expensive. And so a moving key keyboard would add size, so the product would have to grow for various reasons just to get the mechanics in. And the other significant difference is that the Spectrum would be a colour machine, because the ZX81 and the 80 were just black and white or monochrome. And also it was more powerful, and it did lots of the usual thing. Everything was a little bit faster, better, and all the rest of it. So that needed a bit more space, and so the keyboard actually. And remember, it's all about the smallest that a product can be, but you mustn't forget ergonomics. You don't want to be there with a toothpick trying to work on the keys and stuff like that. So the keyboard really set the width of the product. This is this. Oh yes, I remember another thing. The amount of data that had to go on the keys was a graphic designer's nightmare. So I probably spent as much time working on the graphics of the keys as I did the physical aspects of the product. So I think some keys had as much as 7 different items of data. Right, now you think about that, we're talking about quite a small keyboard here to start with, but big enough so your finger can sit on it and not touch the next key accidentally. So you can put information on the tops of the keys, above the key, and below. Now, depending on where that key happens to be, imagine it's a middle-ish row. You put information on the top or the bottom of, above or below that key. Is that relating to the next key row above or the next key row below? And all these sorts of things is like, and trying to make this massive information. I mean, there were literally several hundred items of information that had to go on this keyboard to make it clear, so it was obvious. So the layout and where items were positioned was the first level of logic. The second layer or level of logic was colour. You can immediately see where something is, well, all those function keys are red and all this type of sub-function key are green or whatever. So I spent a lot of time on that, and that took up space. And then we had to figure out how we were going to actually manufacture this. How are you going to apply all this stuff? And then we'd come up with this rubber keyboard design, which was quite clever because with a single component you had all your keys. So you had your keys, you had a surface to print the data on, the key could collapse and it would return with its own force once you took your finger off. You just needed a switching device underneath, which was simply a membrane keyboard like we'd had on the ZX80 or the 81. So that dictated the width of the machine, and it gave us some height, and it gave us a depth consideration. And the rest was down to the electronics, which how high are the highest components, how low are the lowest, how can we distribute this so we don't have a lumpy product or a product that's higher than it needs to be. The highest component was the TV modulator, so I stuck that at the back away from underneath the keyboard to keep the height down. So that's why you end up with that little bump at the back, so you just continued across. The Spectrum was desperate for detail, though. I knew it had to rely on immaculate detailing, and we had some wonderful materials. So we had injection molded plastic, we had pressed metal, pressed aluminium that would be screen printed, which is the escutcheon that went around the keys and curled around the side, and then we had the rubber. So you've got 3 different materials, 3 different manufacturing processes, and 3 different finishes, whether you like it or not. So we had a lot to play with, and it was just about combining those in a way that was as immaculate as possible. And the manufacturers were superb. We didn't have CAD in those days; it was all drawings, and everything just fitted the first time. It was just, there's a lot of luck, and where the metal plate swoops around it, there's a lot of complexity, because as you bend a piece like that and it was angled back, it takes this quite complex sort of conics form, and you've got to echo that into the injection moulding. Well, how do you do that if you don't have 3D CAD, and how do you do it on a drawing? And so there's a lot of interpretation with the tool makers. You spend a lot of time with them, getting them to understand your intent. And it worked out quite well. So really, those are the sort of, people think you go away and you're inspired by something and just come up with a shape. It really just isn't like that at all. It's like a steam engine. It's driven by what it does.